So welcome, all you good people who've joined us here today, this afternoon. I want to contextualize why we are here today in terms of the dialogue we wanted to have with those who follow the real news on a regular basis and those who don't, in terms of addressing this very difficult time we are in our history of the Trump era. And for that purpose, we have asked that a very esteemed panel of guests to join us. And I'm going to introduce each of the guests right before they speak, so it's just directly related. But I'm going to start with our CEO and the senior editor of the Real News Network, Paul Jay, so he can give you some context as to why this discussion is necessary at this time. And as you may already know, Paul Jay, CEO of the Real News Network, and also the senior editor of the Real News Network. And before he started the Real News Network back in 2003, 2004, for 10 years, he was the executive producer of a program, a debate program on CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's. For 10 years, he was there producing a show called Counterspin, and it was the main daily debate show for a good long period of time in Canada. And he's also a documentary filmmaker, and in around 2006 to 2008, we made the transition to come to the United States and base ourselves first in Washington and then now in Baltimore, Maryland. And I'm going to call on Paul to contextualize this conversation, and then I'll introduce the other guests shortly after. So welcome, and Paul.
Thank you. You would think after all these years in broadcasting, so it is working. Oh,
Yeah, very good.
further proof I didn't know how to use the microphone. So the theme of the discussion is the real news in the age of Trump. Another way of saying that, it wasn't early in the 20th century, various people, including Lenin, described this stage of capitalism as its final stage. I think the final stage is maybe taking longer than people thought. And in the scheme of history, it's actually not all that long. But I think for various reasons, we're in the final stage of the final stage. That isn't to say it's imminent. The final stage of the final stage could be hundreds of years of a totally science fiction dystopian world. Or we could be on the verge of some quite transformative political change, and I think either of these possibilities is there. The age of Trump. The age of Trump means the age when the American political system nakedly exposed how dysfunctional and parasitical the economics and politics of the country has become. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, certainly in any Q&A and also tonight at the plenary. But the financialization of the economy and the dominance of big banks and finance capital, the extent of the inequality has created a situation, I think, where there is such an orgy of profit-making taking place that even those voices that in the past could see the need for systemic reforms to defend the system, even those voices are marginalized now. Just for an example, somebody like a Soros who calls for financial reform is ridiculed by the head of JP Morgan Chase. the extent to which the system is in denial, both of not just the threats on in terms of the financial architecture and so on, but obviously most of all climate change, the coming effects of artificial intelligence and what that's going to mean to massive unemployment. Trump's a very good symbol to prove the statement that these elites are not fit to rule. In a way, I don't think you could say in the past. So covering Trump for us at The Real News, and why we want to have this kind of conversation, is we need to, when we talk about Trump, not get hung up with or distracted by secondary issues here. Not to say they're not issues, but they're secondary. And I'm talking anything from Russiagate to his personality, which is what most of the corporate media covers. I was reading an article this morning on The Intercept. They did a good piece about what's happening at the American-Mexican border and the separation of children from their parents. Apparently they lost track of 1,400 kids. The parents are living in terror that they may never see their children again. This is Nazi-like. So we're in a very urgent moment, and when we cover Trump, we need to. I said I'm going to say this tonight, but we can't treat people like infants. This whole culture is based on the infantilization of political discourse, and we can't talk about the big picture. You know, as much as we need to fight, you know, for healthcare for all, and you know, minimum wage and all of these things, which are important reforms, even much of the left are treating people like infants. Oh, you can't talk about how serious the climate crisis is because it will overwhelm people. Well, we're not infants. More to that, if we don't talk to people and tell people the whole truth, people can't act. Frankly, I don't even think they can really get engaged even in the more immediate reforms. And I'm not suggesting the reforms aren't important. They are. But we're in a very urgent situation. So we want to have a discussion about how we're doing, what we should be doing, and we've invited our guests to help contextualize even, you know, the moment we're in, and also the promise, because I think as dangerous as the moment is, it's also filled with a promise of transformation that we haven't seen before. So I think that's enough to get started with.
All right. All right, Gar, let me go to you next. And what I'm going to do is have each of the panelists that are up here speak for 10 minutes. And then we're going to also call on some of our producers at The Real News who are also here. I'll introduce them in time. And then hopefully we want to really have a dialogue with you in terms of how to proceed. You know, we can, for today, assume that you're our editorial board and you're going to give us some direction on this. So let me start with Gar. Gar Alpowitz is co-founder of the Democracy Collaborative and co-chair of the Next Systems Project. He's a historian and a political economist, activist, and writer. And for 15 years, he was the Lionel R. Bauman Professor of Political Economy at the University of Maryland. And he's the former fellow of King's College, Cambridge. And he was also at Harvard at the Institute of Politics, which is also an institute on policy studies. And then he's also had been a guest scholar at Brookings Institution, which is an interesting challenge. And he's also, he has written many books, but the latest and the most important among them that I found is What Then Must We Do? Its title, Straight Talk About the Next American Revolution. Welcome, Gar.
Thank you. 10 minutes, so this is going to be intense. I'm a historian and a political economist, so I see the picture always, or attempt to, as an emerging dynamic rather than a snapshot, what is beginning to move forward over time. And Trump has obviously foregrounded a lot of the most obvious difficulties and pain and structures and dangers of the American system. There is also another story going on. And if you look closely, but the press, except for Real News and a couple others, don't cover it, but they will begin to cover it. There is a lot going on around the country in a very different way. Many people know about the growth of cooperatives and worker ownership and that development process. There is some advanced development of that kind in Cleveland. Many people know about the Cleveland Evergreen model, which is now the largest worker cooperative in the United States, anchored in a community structure, a community-wide structure to which it is responsible, and also purchasing power of hospitals and universities are beginning to focus on building a whole new structure by giving contracts to worker-owned companies. That kind of thing is happening in many parts of the country. The Cleveland model is the most expansive. What's important, it has been developing over time under the radar. In another realm, the community public banking structures are exploding around the country. There are municipally owned banks being established or attempting to be established in many, many parts of the country. The governor of New Jersey, who just won, came in campaigning for a state-owned bank. Michigan is proposing a state-owned bank. Los Angeles, Oakland, Denver, Washington, D.C. There are about 30 cities now and several states, some of which are very close to putting up a public bank, but there is an emergence that shows the politics of it opens up socializing parts of the banking system in America under ordinary developmental processes. In other parts of the country, there are about 180 land trusts, neighborhood ownership, collectivized, democratized ownership underneath the radar. We're seeing this kind of development in many parts of the country, and simultaneously, did you notice that the word socialism has become legitimate? Striking. No one would, certainly in my generation, have predicted that there would be use of a term that is so challenging to American capitalism, and yet over 50% of the young people in the country, large numbers voted for Bernie, 50% of the young people in the country easily support the word socialism. There's a debate which opens the idea that something beyond Trump, but also beyond the last democratic government, something new is needed. So I want to suggest to you, and if we had time, more than 10 minutes, but by way of introduction, if you look closely at what's going on in many parts of the country, you will find another phenomenon building up over time and another set of changes in the idea system. Both are important. The development of projects on the ground that begin to show a different way of democratizing ownership, piece by piece, locality by locality, in real life, and simultaneously the opening up of space for a conversation about something called socialism. Now, I'm a historian. That looks to me like the prehistory of a developing movement and a developing shift in the idea system. Absolutely critical to get beyond the current moment. And if we watch Donald Trump play out his cards, as he will, either successfully or in terms of violence, we may go through a very ugly period. One of the things that's happened is that the old traditional democratic structures of American liberalism, out of which I came, and I think liberalism is a very important advance, but it has lost its traditional base. Now, this is a little piece of the puzzle I want to just lay on the ground in my 10 minutes, probably 2 minutes left. That structure of politics out of which many people on the left came, depended upon a particular structure in the system, which was basically large corporations counterbalanced by union structure to a degree, both on the shop floor, but also politically. Without the muscle of labor unions, you couldn't do much in the Democratic Party. That was the old structure. It's the same structure throughout Western Europe that is slowly declining behind us. That structure in the United States is collapsed almost entirely. It was never very large, 34.5% of the labor force organized at its peak. The Swedes are at 85%, and is now down to 11%, 6% in the private sector and declining. So the institutional power base of that old system is in decay. Lots of pain coming out of that. But it is also paving the way for a radicalization, either a soft radicalization, let's build a community bank tomorrow, or a hard radicalization, Black Lives Matter, or in between, aware that there is not going to be progress unless the system is changed. That was not the previous understanding. And what we're beginning to see is a shift at the level of understanding of how deep the crisis is and therefore what is required. That could take us in very dangerous waters. Violence and repression is quite possible. But it also leads to people making commitments for the long haul, looking at these experiments on democratizing ownership, building up from the bottom, and beginning to rethink both a vision of a democratic socialism, something that begins at the bottom and works its way up and has concrete elements, worker ownership, land ownership, public ownership, municipalization, starting there and up to regional structures, et cetera, et cetera. That debate is also beginning. The Next System Project has convened conferences at Harvard and Yale on this subject, where we get major 6, 7, I think there are now 10 presidents of academic organizations, political science, sociology, et cetera, even one from the American management, calling for this debate at a higher level. So I think it's very important, and I'll stop here, that we begin to see not only the dangers of Trump, but not to be stared into out of existence, but to look back and say, what is the long path that builds up to and through and beyond? At the same time, we begin to look at the horrors of this and challenge some of the horrors of the Trump administration. I am, as a historian, slowly and quietly confident about the future. That may be a surprise to most people in this room. I think we have a building up of power that could take us beyond in the moment of crisis.
Gar, let me pick up on 2 points you have made, which is that you see encouraging signs, and also that the Next Systems Project is something that you've been engaged in and working on. So highlight some of those encouraging signs, and of course, what you're learning from the Next Systems Project in terms of overhauling the system we are in.
Well, I've given you a few of the encouraging signs. Let me give you one more that's kind of interesting because it's transatlantic and going back and forth, and then I'll try to answer the second question in this time available. One of the really encouraging signs, how many people know the structure of the Evergreen Corporation in Cleveland? So let me briefly say what it is. So this is one of the things that the Real News has covered, and some other parts of the press have covered, but it's very well known amongst people who are activists involved in trying to change ownership. This is Cleveland, a very poor neighborhood, 40,000 people, average family income $20,000, unemployment at least 20%, mostly Black. It's in the middle of that community that stand 3 major entities: Cleveland Clinic, one of the largest in the community, one of the largest hospitals in the world, and most successful. University Hospital, another hospital system, and Case Western Reserve University. In that community, there's been established now, it's in the 10th year, I think, a community-wide nonprofit corporation covering the community, to which are attached worker-owned cooperatives. They are not freestanding by design because the goal is to build the community, not simply to enrich some workers, but also to give power to the workers. That organization is now reaching to 250 workers involved, and some of the contracts from these publicly supported institutions, universities and hospitals, a lot of public money, are used to purchase from the worker cooperative structure, both to build the worker cooperatives and then to build the community because it's part of a larger structure. So that's the basic structure, and it is growing now rapidly in the replications. That model here was picked up recently in Great Britain in the city of Preston. And even more important, because a public bank is being attached to that, and it's in the it's a socialist kind of context, so they're building that out and reflecting what can happen. The Labour Party has picked it up as a model in Britain. And we're beginning to see the reciprocation of those ideas. I think you're going to hear a lot about the British model and pointing towards what can be done in the United States because it's a replication of an American model. So there is a developmental process at the level of taking things that are many cities are using city money to help co-ops. That's very common. New York, Madison, Pittsburgh, et cetera, and Texas as well, many cities. But taking it to the next level of power and politics and possibility in Cleveland, but now replicating and expanding the model in a way that raises the heights to another level. So we're seeing that kind of process, and it comes out of pain. And the failure of the existing system is driving this. If things were all fine in Cleveland, you wouldn't see anything like this. And in many communities, that's what's driving the public banking system as well. So the process at work is what I call evolutionary reconstruction. Rather than reform, you don't change the system at all, you just try to improve it a little bit. Or rather than revolution, it is an exploding, evolving, changing process that begins to lay groundwork. So that's one possibility for the long haul. Another possibility related to that, do you remember 10 years ago, we essentially nationalized General Motors, Chrysler Corporation, 5 major banks, and AIG, the largest insurance company in the world. Those of you who know what insurance is, it's a bank, basically taking your money and then reinvesting. That's how the game works in insurance companies. We nationalized them, plus we nationalized the 2 big housing organizations, which are so-called independent organizations that in the United States when the crisis occurred. And given the way Trump is tearing down protections around the economy, we can predict future crises too as well if we're prepared. Now the current, and I'm gonna give you an idea why ideas sometimes matter. I work in ideas. I'm a political economist and historian. And I don't think ideas matter all the time. In fact, in politics, they don't matter much. What matters is power. But not always, not always. When things are really falling apart, then people are looking for alternative ideas. So some of the projects I've been talking about in the banking developments live in the idea system as well as on the ground, and they give people a sense of what could be done. So that's always the prehistory of fundamental change, the creation of models that also give people a sense of what might be possible. The current discussion of what's going to happen when the big banks go down again, because they're tearing down the regulations and they are over-investing and they're speculating. They've taken down the Volcker rule, which prevented banks from investing both in bonds and also in speculative material. We're going to see future banking crises. The current line amongst liberal politicians, the best of them, is when that happens, we should break them up. And what we know about from Standard Oil and AT&T in American history, what happens when you break them up is they get back together and they reassemble. There is an alternative discussion building on the public banking system. And I happen to have here, because we just published it. This says, how do you nationalize the banks? It's a very sophisticated study that says, let's take all this experience at the local level. When the big crisis comes, it'll be time for us to be prepared with a real model of how you can do it. Nationalized banks are very common around the world. So there's a lot of experience and models everywhere you can build upon and draw upon. The French, the Japanese, the Swedes, the Germans. There is a tremendous amount of experience that can build on the local model building from the bottom up, but also moving to the top as well. And we're beginning to see that kind of intellectual development as well as program development, laying groundwork for the next transformation. Now, I didn't say achieving the revolution. I said building up what is the prehistory of the next major fight that needs to be fought, but that we are not without experience, we're not without projects on the ground, and we're beginning to see things that can be developed around the country in many parts of the country. In June, there will be a meeting of the New Economy Movement. They have them every other year. The last one, there were 1,000 practitioners, not people just advocating, people doing the kind of things I'm talking about. And when 1,000 come to a conference, you know there are 10,000 out there who actually are learning these skills and trying to do this in their own communities from the bottom up. So I see a qualified developmental period. I'm not a utopian, but I see a qualified developmental period of growing anger at what's happening with Trump, the loss of the traditional model that tried to hold things together in the old way, out of which I come, American liberalism, allow the corporations to control the system and try to do something around the outside, and the beginning of a whole development of a new process. At the same time, there's an intellectual development of what is it you want? And let me put this to the person in your seat. If you don't like capitalism and you don't like state socialism, what is it you want? We need answers to those questions that are serious answers rather than rhetoric. And what is exciting in this sense, in the prehistory of the next big move, is that there are huge numbers of people debating this in a serious way. Rick Wolf is one of them, who believes worker-owned companies should be the basis. The model of community ownership is another. There are ecological people involved, creating a rich and informed dialogue. It's like the period of the committees of correspondence, beginning to lay groundwork for what becomes a transformative set of ideas in the American Constitution at that point. A limited document, but nonetheless prepared for that way. So if you stand back and say we're in a period of historical transformation, Donald Trump is not the only piece of the action. There's something else going on, the sort of thing that we, people like us, can work on and build and develop as we develop movement building. There's some really exciting possibilities. And if you want to look at one of the most, I just came from a discussion of Jackson, Mississippi, and some of you know there's a very exciting project there because they have the mayor's office and they're attempting to build the same kind of models from the bottom up, and they have the mayor's office to work with. So that's a very broad sketch. I usually try to develop in an hour, but I want to give you kind of, that's the short version of why I think that we are not without hope. We may go through much more violent periods. We may go through periods of repression, but where there is something else that has very important consequences if we also simultaneously build forward.
Thank you, Gar. Also want to urge some of you who want to explore further Gar's ideas and thoughts. We do have a series on the Real News Network with Gar Opowitz on a program we run called The Reality Asserts Itself that Paul Jay is the chair of on the Real News Network. The program is called Reality Asserts Itself. It's chaired or hosted by Paul Jay, and we have a series with Gar Opowitz exploring some of these ideas. All right, let me introduce Dr. Horn, Dr. Gerald Horn. He holds the Moores Professorship of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He has written over 30 books and 100 scholarly articles. And let me only mention two of them here: The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America, and The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, The Roots of Slavery, and another book, which is White Supremacy and Capitalism in the 17th Century, North America and the Caribbean, which was just published recently. Very good, Gerald. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Now, the theme of our gathering is towards a new strategy for the left. And I think that if we're going to develop a new strategy, we may need a new conception of how we reach this point of crisis. And we may, to put it in another sort of way, try to come to a newer understanding of how and why it is that we are sitting here in North America speaking English, a language developed in Northwest Europe, when that has only been the case perhaps for a few hundred years. And what's striking about the present moment is that, to put it in one way, that some of our liberal elite scholars are further to the left in their understanding of that issue I just posed than some who are part of the, quote, radical left, unquote. What I mean is, if you look at a recent prize-winning book on the origins of the United States, I'm speaking of Robert Parkinson's The Common Cause. The Common Cause, as he tells the story, was, of course, a dispossession of the indigenous and enslavement of the Africans. If you look at the book by Harvard law professor Michael Klarman, The Framers' Coup, I think that title says it all. And what's striking is that I think our friends on the left are, in a sense, they're still dealing with biology pre-Crick and Watson, pre-discovery of DNA. And many of the scholars have moved on. Even liberal scholars have moved on. And it seems if we're going to develop a new strategy, we may want to develop a new conception of how we got to this place where we are in the first instance, which involves a different understanding of hundreds of years of history. Similarly, if you look at some of the recent writings by members of the anti-Trump faction of the US ruling elite, they're sounding the alarm about fascism. I'm thinking of Madeleine Albright, the former US Secretary of State, Fascism: A Warning, the former Obama administration official and Harvard law professor, Cass Sunstein, in his collection, Can It Happen Here? Obviously a play on the 1930s work, It Can't Happen Here. If you look at the novel by the recently deceased Philip Roth, The Plot Against America, for example, a story about the rise of fascism in the United States. Or Michael Kinsley, one of the first people to sound the alarm after Trump was elected. And of course, he's an heir by marriage to the Microsoft fortune, a former editor of the New Republic. He was one of the first individuals to sound the alarm about Trump as fascist. Whereas many of our friends on the left, oftentimes they try to diminish this notion of alarm. They tell us oftentimes that many of the Trump voters in 2016 voted for Obama in 2008 and 2012, and so we shouldn't perhaps be that concerned because they can be won over again in 2018, 2020. Of course, that liquidates the question of male supremacy and patriarchy in terms of trying to understand that putative shift. And then oftentimes, depending on who's talking, they'll tell us that, well, the Trump average or median, because they shift like a shell game, Trump voter, the income is $72,000, and that doesn't sound like a working class to me, although I'm not sure if they kept up with wages concerning teachers, police officers, military officers, construction workers, miners that are working, et cetera. And I'm not sure if that sort of diminishing of the crisis that we're in is very helpful. All that it may guarantee is that we may have a lot of time to pore over these questions when we're in the internment camp in Yankee Stadium. Now, I think part of the problem with the anti-Trump faction of the US ruling elite is that if you look at their analysis, is that you'd never know that it should not be considered particularly remarkable that a nation that was based upon mass enslavement and mass dispossession at a certain point may tip into fascism. And I think part of the problem is that oftentimes the radical left historians, so-called, and scholars, so-called, don't take that into account as well, because they're in such a hurry and a kind of an ineffective opportunism to build a bridge to voters who they think are seized with the idea of US patriotism, that they play down the, shall we say, darker chapters of US history. Now, the other aspect of these analyses, Albright, Roth, et cetera, in addition to not taking into account real history, is that you never know that US foreign policy has engineered fascist coups in Chile in 1973, supported apartheid South Africa to its retreat in 1994. And so, of course, if you're going to engineer fascism abroad, inevitably that'll come back to bite you at home. But once again, even though the liberal elites are telling us about fascism, their analysis is not very helpful in terms of trying to understand the true roots of this phenomenon. And what that also means is that in terms of digging ourselves out of this hole, apparently they can't count, because they would, if they could count, they'd realize that their faction is heavily dependent upon Black votes. But of course, you can't come to that realization in the United States, either because we're supposed to be all colorblind, or it's considered impolite to point out that in 1991, David Duke, a Klansman and Nazi, won 55% of the Euro-American vote in the race for governor. And that's a kind of inconvenient truth that we're not supposed to talk about, because it disrupts the comfortable narrative about the United States. I would say that a turning point in terms of how we got to this point, if we are or were to do a deeper analysis, would not only be to go back to the origins of settler colonialism, in the 1600s, but to also look at the 1950s when the US ruling elite was forced under unremitting global pressure from national liberation movements, from the socialist camp, et cetera, to make an agonizing retreat from the more egregious aspects of Jim Crow. At the same time, because of Red Scare and Cold War pressures, began to bludgeon left-leaning unions, such as the International Longshore and Warehousemen's Union under Harry Bridges, and unions under Ferdinand Smith, the leader of the National Maritime Union. And so with this kind of advance, if you like, on the race front and retreat on the class front, this not only creates this dilemma whereby the presumed beneficiaries of the advance on the race front get the right to eat in restaurants, but then because of the attack on unions, don't have the money to pay the bill. But then it sets up this present day dilemma where a good deal of the population defined as white, if you look at these racial resentment studies of 2016, tend to feel that the US ruling elite does not care about them, but they care about the people of color. Because of course they don't have this, this global analysis that recognizes that this retreat on the race front was driven in large measure by the fact that the US ruling class found it difficult to point the finger of accusation with regard to human rights violations in the socialist camp when the United States had its own particular level of apartheid. So where does this leave us in terms of covering the real news? How many minutes do I have left? Oh, I'll take a couple. One is that, first of all, I salute the real news. I remember the first time I went to their headquarters in Baltimore, I was rather stunned to see so many young Black people working there. I mean, that's not the U.S. model, even in a city like Baltimore, because the U.S. model, you would have all these young white people, and then if you raise anything about it, they accuse you of identity politics. You're supposed to just sort of accept that reality. And given that staff, I would say that you're on the right track, because I think going forward, covering the real news means being hyper-local and hyper-global. What I mean is digging oneself into a particular community. And I would say further, in terms of political strategy, covering relentlessly immigrant issues. For example, in New York City, that would mean not only covering what's happening, the Mexican population in New York has really grown exponentially in recent years, which is not surprising given the fact that Mexico is the largest Spanish-speaking country in the world, and in Latin America, of course. And so what that means is not only covering their issues, but then covering this election in Mexico, which if we're lucky and if polls are correct, will lead to AMLO's election, which I think could really be a game changer, which will open the door for what has been our saving grace in terms of this right-wing country, which is building bridges abroad, starting with Mexico in the first instance, and then with Trump now alienating Canada concerning these tariffs. That also means building bridges to Canada. And of course, there's a large Canadian, not necessarily illegal, for reasons that need not detain us here, but Canadian population in the United States. And I think that this emphasis on the hyper-local and the hyper-global will help us to countervail these very powerful right-wing sentiments and currents in this country, which seems to me is an inevitable development of how this once settler regime was built. And if you look historically, the way we've been able to overcome this right-wing tendency in the United States is precisely through building bridges abroad. So thank you very much.
Gerald, to your point about addressing hyperlocal and global at the same time. So sorry. Gerald, to your point about hyperlocal and global at the same time, which is a specific challenge we've taken up at the Real News Network, digging deep into Baltimore and unraveling the issues that ordinary people are facing. and also encourage citizen engagement in the solutions to the problems in their own communities, like policing, the education system, the water supply, and so forth. And then, of course, addressing, as you said, what is happening in Mexico and so forth. I was wondering if you could elaborate in ways, drawing from history, ways in which we can better explain that dynamic.
Mhm. Well, drawing from history and explaining a current dynamic, I think, for example, of all the headlines we've had of late with regard to the Starbucks incident in Philadelphia, the barbecuing while black incident in Oakland, the Yale student police called upon her, the police killings that have given rise to Black Lives Matter. There's been a lot of focus on this, but not necessarily an emphasis on the historical roots of this. I mean, for example, if you look at what the historians are telling us now, and I'm talking about liberal historians, not necessarily the left historians, who, as I say, oftentimes are still trapped in sort of pre-DNA biology, in the early 1950s. The historians are telling us that if you look at the United States, say from its origins up to the end of the 19th century, you have basically three factions amongst Euro-American opinion. You have an anti-slavery faction, John Brown, which of course is a minority faction. Then you have a pro-slavery faction, which is a huge faction, includes the founders, Washington, Madison, Jefferson, and then the Confederates, Jefferson Davis. And then you have what has been mischaracterized as an anti-slavery faction, which is really the white man's country faction. Oregon, when it was admitted to the Union in the 1850s, no Negroes allowed. Therefore, Portland, even today, has one of the smallest black populations in the United States of America. And of course, Lincoln was a captive for a good deal of his career of that particular white man's country faction. And then when he begins to move away from it, as so often happens, he's murdered. But then they emerge triumphant, and then you have Jim Crow for decades, which basically expresses the white man's country faction after a failed deportation effort, a failed mass deportation effort. And so historically, there has been this effort to create these all-white spaces, which is why you have the Starbucks incident, perhaps even an audience like this. And so it becomes very difficult to go against that because the historical roots are so deep, and I don't think that our radicals are not doing a very good job of explaining that phenomenon, and the liberals' spine becomes stiffer if there are radicals pushing them, but that's not the case right now, in my opinion. So the liberals are sort of out on their own, trying to reconstruct in their own feeble way what's happened, and I think that helps to lead to our dilemma. So I think in terms of press coverage, not necessarily in terms of real news, but perhaps in terms of Pacifica, is that it would be very useful to have more historical background with regard to these proliferating incidents. Because otherwise, I think it leads to the mistaken conclusion that these are all sorts of accidents, that these are all coincidences. And in this basically sound and good country that had this grand revolution guaranteeing liberty and freedom and all the other nostrums and fairy tales that are routinely fed to us, including by some who consider themselves to be radical.
Excellent. Thank you, Gerald. Thank you. All right. This is a nice segue to Darna Noor. Darna is a host and producer at the Real News Network and the managing editor of our Baltimore bureau. Darna focuses on environmental and climate justice issues in Baltimore as well as beyond. She's called on a lot to cover national and international environmental issues as well. And before coming to TRNN, Darna studied political philosophy and was studied vocal music at Sarah Lawrence College. And although she has not produced as many books as Gerald Horne, the body of what she has produced at the Real News in the short time she has been there could constitute a few books. So welcome, Darna.
Well, thank you. As Charmony said, I've written far fewer books than Dr. Horn, so I'll keep my remarks brief. But I am very much tasked with the sort of strange and joyous job of bringing the most global issue, which is that of climate change and the environmental crisis, to the most local bureau that we have at the Real News Network, which is our Baltimore bureau. And I, sort of took this upon myself because I was, during the presidential election, which was really atrocious for many reasons. There were only 96 minutes of mass media coverage on climate, and that includes climate denial. That's like a very short Netflix binge, 96 minutes through the entirety of Trump's campaign. That's I think an instance of, as Dr. Horn was saying, diminishing alarm. Really, there's no excuse for that sort of lack of media coverage. And local media in Baltimore is really no better. I mean, this isn't like a partisan issue. Baltimore is a blue state, but just last week we had recent flooding that destroyed a town just outside of Baltimore, Ellicott City, destroyed a town, and there was so little, conversation in the media about the role of the climate crisis in all of this. It's not just the climate crisis. Of course, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's not just a story of the Chesapeake Bay warming and worse rains in the area, but it's also a story of overdevelopment. It's a story of development on a hill which created so much impervious surface, got rid of so many trees and so much soil that when it rains, there's nowhere for the water to go but down the hill. It's a story of policy that was taken away by our lovely governor, Larry Hogan. He mockingly referred to as the rain tax, which would require developers to deal with stormwater runoff and put a portion of their taxes into dealing with stormwater runoff. But it is also, of course, a question of climate change, a story of climate change. And, in these sorts of disasters, I think that there's often this impetus on us to not to politicize them in the face of people telling us not to politicize disaster. Not politicizing a political disaster doesn't make any sense to me. And when I spoke to the county executive of Howard County, who has Ellicott City in his jurisdiction, he essentially said to me not to talk about climate change because this was a question of people who had lost their homes. One man lost his lives, not a question of climate change, as though those things can possibly be unrelated. And sometimes when I tell people in Baltimore that I'm working on climate and I'm working on the environment, they'll ask me, how can you focus on climate and the environment when over 300 people are murdered every year? So we lose so many lives to gun violence. But in fact, air pollution from particulate matter actually kills 3 to 4 times more people in Baltimore every year than die from gun violence. From things like smog, from our incinerator, from air pollution, from landfills that we have in our city. And all of these, I think, are facts that people really need to know, but I don't think that, as Paul was saying, there's really often, we don't respect people. We don't assume that people can understand these kinds of facts. We expect that people are, too dumb or too overwhelmed to internalize these kinds of things. And lately I've been kind of interested in trying to present these facts, not as just facts, but as stories, and not just like the story of climate change, not just the story of emissions, but I mean stories with characters in them, because Baltimore is a city full of incredible people, incredible characters. It's a city where young people, it was a high school student who led a movement to stop an incinerator being built in her neighborhood in Southwest Baltimore. It was a group of high school students that were able to ban styrofoam in Baltimore this past year. So those kinds of stories, I think, can really, help sort of humanize the immediate effects of things like the environmental crisis and climate change. So I hope that I can play a small part in sort of advancing that message to hopefully affect some change at some point.
Great.
Thank you. Donna, I was going to ask you a question, but that very succinct presentation you made kind of got at it. Do you want to address what some of the challenges are that you are confronting in terms of covering? You actually made a very good point, which is about the death rates, which, can you elaborate on that? Are you coming across those kinds of difficulties? Also, applying it to the age of Trump, when so much of environmental protections that were put in place with great difficulty is getting rolled back.
I guess one thing that's really different in local reporting and local journalism than in like the national and international reporting that I've done is like I've never had to look Scott Pruett in the face. I've never had to look Donald Trump in the face and say like, you know, F you for all these rollbacks, for all of these all this deregulation. But I have had to look, you know, the county executive of Howard County, Kettleman, in the face and ask him about climate change. Or, you know, I know every city council member in Baltimore now, and I know the ones who supported a ban on crude oil facilities, and I know the ones who didn't. So I think that's challenging for me, is being able to actually like being given the opportunity and responsibility to actually speak to the people in power who are making these decisions that affect people every day.
All right, if you notice those pings going back and forth, that's what is Paul asking for a few more minutes to contextualize the discussion. Go ahead, Paul.
I just want to add one thing that I hope we can discuss too. None of us have yet mentioned that there's an election about to take place and that we're heading towards the 2020 elections. And as much as we discuss these things at sort of systemic and historical levels, big picture, and must, as I suggested in the beginning, this 2020 election is going to have a lot to do with what happens to humanity. And I think what I call civil war inside the Democratic Party, the relationship of the party to building a movement in the streets, what as a news organization, how we cover this, because the electoral side of this fight is as or more important in this 2020 election than I think it's ever been. And I think most people in this gathering understand that a continuation of a Trump presidency or a Pence presidency, what a disaster that will be. On the other hand, we know it was a corporate Democrat presidency that gave birth to the Trump presidency. And if we just repeat that cycle, the Trump that comes next probably won't be quite such a clown. The one saving grace right now is the dysfunctionality of this Trump administration and the fact that the elites have a bit of a war going with each other is a somewhat of a plus here. But I think, as Gerald mentioned, well, let's put it this way. Let's try not to meet in Yankee Stadium to continue this discussion.
All right. All right. Thank you. So, Greg, let me go to you. So, Greg Wilpert, he is a producer, a host, but really our right-hand person when it comes to publishing at The Real News. He keeps us all in line. And Greg, one of the areas of coverage that you have been preoccupied for The Real News, you do everything, but you also have been having a special focus on Latin America at a time when things are shifting politically in terms of, there's this possibility in Mexico, but at the same time, all of the other major Latin American countries who were in the past left, moderate, liberal, some of them, governments, but that the situation has changed dramatically. So if in your comments you could address that, would be good. You can actually take this one. Okay.
I'll just stand. Yeah, I mean, let me just start a little bit further back in terms of what I think is also in terms of a challenge at the moment for us at the Real News, which is that, it's generally taken for granted that basically a right-wing government such as the Trump administration represents an opportunity for the left because it's, something to organize, something to mobilize around, it's generally taken for granted that a democratic government, such as the Obama administration, is a period of demobilization and so on. And I think that's probably true to some extent. But the challenge there, I think, is that we face the danger, and I think in various ways this has come up already, which is the danger that we focus only on Trump and his clownishness or whatever, and forget to see the forest for the trees, so to speak. That we, in other words, focus on specifically the outrageousness of Trump without digging deeper into the systematic crisis that Trump in many ways represents. And that's what I think what we're trying to do in a way is to go beyond that and to look at the systemic issues. But it's not always so easy. It's always very difficult because there's all these little battles going on, these little outrageousness that you also have to pay attention to and have to point out. So that's a real problem, of course. And then also, and internationally, this happens as well. And so if we're looking at what's happening, for example, in Latin America, it's again very easy to get caught up in the latest, let's say, neoliberal policies that are being imposed in Argentina, or the latest murders that are happening of organizers in Colombia, or of journalists in Mexico, for example, without seeing again the larger picture of what's going on. And so this is a real problem. Now, of course, in terms of trying to point out, and so of course we try to find people who can talk to those issues and look at the big picture. And it's not easy. And of course, this is also, again, the temptation. I mean, what the big picture, of course, also I think implies is specifically looking at, and as Gar Alprovitz was saying, as what the alternatives are. And of course, the problem is that sometimes the alternatives that present themselves in various places, at least as immediate, the most kind of tangible ones, will be an improvement perhaps sometimes, but not necessarily go beyond the system as it is. So, I mean, I don't have a particular solution or anything. I just wanted to point out what those challenges are for us on a day-to-day basis of trying to find the people who can take up that bigger vision. And of course, this means also, and it's not always has to be intellectuals or academics. I mean, sometimes, and this is again where the point that Gar was making in terms of what's happening on the local level sometimes does represent an important alternative, and that can be built up upon. That hopefully the larger movements perhaps that might be in existence will pick those up. So anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, but I just want to say a few words.
Talk about the emerging, I guess, the rays of light that's possible in Latin America, including what's happening in Mexico. Hope, the rays of hope.
Well, I mean, I think the one was that Gerald already mentioned is certainly in Mexico. I think also the possibility in Colombia. I mean, it's still a little bit remote what's happening there. Of course, this is a very difficult time right now in Latin America, and of course, the one that's closest to my heart is what's happening in Venezuela. There it's perhaps the most difficult, and right now it's very difficult to see any kinds of rays of hope actually at the moment because it's going through an extremely difficult situation. But I think, and this is what we saw, is that when, for example, in Venezuela, when President Chavez got elected, that was not just a ray of hope, but it was an inspiration for many of the other countries, and that's why I think Chavez, in a way, made possible the kind of the progressive wave that happened in Latin America. And so hopefully, and this is I think really the main reason why AMLO represents a ray of hope, not just for Mexico, but also for the rest of Latin America, because it will serve his election will serve as an inspiration. Unfortunately, the election in Mexico happens after the one in Colombia. So, in other words, in Mexico, the victory of AMLO, of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, is more likely to happen than the election of Gustavo Petro in Colombia. But that election is coming first, so, and it looks more likely that that he's not going to make it. But I think it's an important development nonetheless, because it does signify a change for Colombia that he even got this far, and that's very important too. Even if he won't get elected. Of course, this also is a temptation to, for us, and it's a danger for us, is always to get hung up on, the next election. So we can't just focus on the election, but just the fact that there is a big movement that has been making progress in Latin America is very important. Of course, if the right-wing candidate in Colombia wins, that's going to be a huge blow. And unfortunately, that looks like the more likely outcome at this moment. But it's going to be a huge blow, because the candidate represents a shift to the right from the current right-wing government in Colombia. In other words, he could actually end up tearing apart the peace agreement that was signed there, which means, and if you want to go really dark, I mean, it could mean a renewed civil war in Colombia, which means, and which could also mean renewed U.S. intervention in Colombia, and all of that could be a huge disaster. That's why, again, the election of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or AMLO for short, is so important, because that could represent a break, breaking that momentum, which another right-wing turn in Colombia could mean. Pardon? In terms of the developments in Brazil, that's more difficult to really say much about it, because we just don't know. There's a lot more uncertainty with Lula da Silva in prison, who is still running ahead in the polls, but currently in prison, and he says he has every intention of running for president from prison. Unfortunately, there's still some more court cases pending in terms of his situation, and it seems possible, and if not likely even, that they will disqualify him as a candidate, in which case he cannot run from prison, and in which case the left in Brazil will remain quite disorganized, because right now everybody is so centered and so focused on Lula. It's unlikely that there's going to be a replacement candidate that could win. And the second candidate is another Trump character. Actually, he's even more atrocious and horrifying than Trump, which is Bolsonaro. And I mean, he praises the former military dictatorship of Brazil, and he's running not a close second, but definitely among all the other candidates, a second place. And so that's, again, a huge danger for Brazil, and what that means if he were to make the president. I can't imagine that he can succeed just because. But I could be wrong, because right now there was this trucker strike that's going on in Brazil, and this trucker strike is actually, even though it's supported by the union movement, it has the trucker strike is also being supported by many right-wing elements that are hoping to basically through the strike, which has paralyzed the country, through the strike they're hoping for a military intervention. And they see that as an opportunity as well. So it's not just that's the irony of the situation. It's not just an opportunity for the left, the strike, which is affecting, it's against the Temer government, which is a conservative government or right-wing government. But the right wing are hoping that this could turn even further right by getting a military intervention, and maybe even or supporting Bolsonaro in the election. So it's a very, very dangerous situation for Brazil and for all of Latin America right now, with the very, very uncertain prospects for the future. I mean, and very undetermined. That is, it's very difficult to say which way it's going to go.
All right, and I should add that Greg, thank you, Greg. I should add that Greg has a very important book, Changing Venezuela by Taking Power, about the policies of the Chavez government. important book. All right, let me go to Aaron Mate. Aaron has been with The Real News. He's a producer, host for the last year. And one of the great challenges that he's faced in covering all sorts of stories on The Real News is, of course, the Russiagate issue and many other things. But Aaron?
Hi there. So yeah, a big focus of mine has been Russiagate. I think it's fascinating for many reasons. It's engulfed political discourse in this country for more than a year. And we've tried to take a different approach to it than most other places have. I think because Russiagate is seen as something that is used to challenge Trump and is something that annoys Trump personally, that means that it's bad for Trump and it's bad for the right-wing agenda that he represents. But I take a sort of a different view. I think it's actually emboldened a very hawkish reactionary agenda. It's been actually actually is being used to weaken the left. But before I get into that, let me just say that my starting point for this whole thing, for this whole issue, is that we shouldn't believe the claims of intelligence agencies, whether they're ours or others, without evidence. And if you look at this Russia thing from the beginning, there's been a dire lack of evidence. So we're told that the Russian government hacked Democratic emails and gave them to WikiLeaks, and our intelligence community says that that's true, but they presented no evidence for it. And whereas most of our media has sort of taken that on faith, I think what's helped set us apart at The Real News is we've simply repeatedly pointed out that there's no evidence yet, and it very well may have happened. But for us to believe it as a public in the same way that we wouldn't believe a different government saying that something is true without evidence, that we don't believe our own. Or at least we don't assume it to be truth. The other thing is that even if Russia did hack Democratic emails and launch this campaign to elect Trump, it would pale in comparison to Western interference in countries around the world. I think everyone in this room knows that. And so accordingly, the magnitude of this issue, this focus on Russia and emails, is not really a reflection, in my view, of the merits of the actual issue, whether it happened or not. It's a reflection of its utility to the domestic elites that are driving it. And by that I mean that I think that the reason why Russiagate is such a huge deal is because it's like a convergence of it has use for too many powerful people, different sectors of the elite who are able to take advantage of it for their own reasons. So it starts with Democrats who immediately after Hillary Clinton lost decided that they lost not because they ran a bad campaign that didn't go to Wisconsin or Michigan, but because of two things. Comey talking about reopening the Clinton email investigation, and also Russia. And they spun those narratives, and it was very successful. And Democrats who lost to one of the worst candidates in history, have every interest in blaming a foreign power for their loss. And I think they've played a huge and destructive role in driving it. That coincides with, there's been a long time bipartisan consensus of hawkishness towards Russia, for many reasons, including the fact that it's profitable for the military-industrial complex to have tensions with the world's other major nuclear power. And then there's I think it's just a psychological aspect for liberals where Trump winning is so traumatizing and so shocking that, people want to have a way to make sense of it. And so the narrative that they've been fed is that it's the fault of this nefarious foreign government. And we see that not just here, or that pattern not just here in the US, but also recently in Britain, where you had this former spy who was poisoned. The British government stood up and said that we know that the nerve agent that was used came from Russia, and we actually know that this was undertaken directly under the orders of Putin. Similar to what we're told here about the hacking of the emails. We're told that the US has intelligence that it came directly from Putin. But again, all this is presented without evidence. And now the victims, the the Skripals are recovering, and all of a sudden this issue is not getting as much attention as it used to be, especially as the official British government narrative has collapsed a little bit. So that's what I find fascinating about this story, and I think it's interesting to provide a different perspective on it, especially from the left, because it's not to challenge Russiagate. I think is not to defend Trump. I think it's to actually challenge an agenda that is being used to empower the people around him, in taking advantage of the fact that we're supposed to be demonizing a foreign power to then shift focus off of looking at our own problems here and looking at all the problems that led to Trump's actual loss. So that's what I've been trying to undertake in covering Russiagate, if that makes any sense.
And next we have Ben Norton. You would have seen Ben. He's joined us recently on The Real News, but he's been undertaking a range of issues and interviews on various topics from Europe to Russia to Yemen to Turkey yesterday, largely covering Eastern and European issues, as well as all kinds of things we throw at him. He's very talented, and thanks for joining us, Ben.
Can I stand here? Is that okay for? Okay. Well, is this fine for audio, or should I use? All right. I just if I rant without any notes, I'll just bloviate for 10 minutes without a direction. So I want to make sure I have some points I wanted to hit. So I'll begin. Today I want to address several different things. I want to largely focus on international politics and what's called U.S. foreign policy. I don't like that term. You can use imperialism. There are other terms, U.S. military aggression, U.S. wars. But I'll use the term foreign policy somewhat loosely. And I also want to talk about Trump and the presentation of Trump by media outlets and how it relates to international politics. So first of all, I think Paul raised a very important point about infantilization. And frequently, media outlets, when they do cover Trump, I think some media outlets, once he's been elected, they have been somewhat fair. Of course, it goes without saying that media outlets gave billions of dollars of free advertisements to Trump during the presidential campaign while ignoring and attacking Bernie Sanders. We saw that Trump would have rallies in which he would incite against immigrants, incite against minority groups and people of color, and incite against women and Muslims, all with not even any analysis, not even any pushback. He would just give an entire platform to speak for an hour and just spew lies and vitriol. But what's interesting is the rebranding post-election. So now some of the same media outlets that helped create Trump, as Michelle Wolf pointed out, I think she was also attacked by media outlets for her speech. But she pointed out toward the end of her speech, very cleverly, she said, she joked that the media treats Trump as an ex-boyfriend. You say you hate him. I think you secretly love him because he helps you sell your books. He helps you make money. Les Moonves, one of the most highly paid media executives in the world, who makes at least $10 million a year, likely more. That's just salary, not considering stock and other options. He infamously remarked that Trump might be bad for the US, but he's great for us. We're making lots of money. The money is raining in. But let's talk about the Washington Post. I think what's very fascinating is the Washington Post has rebranded. Now it has "Democracy Dies in Darkness." Well, that would have been a great slogan in, say, 2002, when the Washington Post, of course, helped sell an illegal, disastrous war that led to the death of 1 million Iraqis, that destabilized the region, that gave birth to what we eventually call ISIS, which was originally Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So it's important to understand how many of these media outlets, the Washington Post certainly not being exceptional, have tried to capitalize off of the resistance in the age of Trump because it's profitable when they actually created him in the first place. And what I think this also underscores is how there are certain norms within corporate media in the US that cannot be challenged. And this is going to bring me to foreign policy, but part of the subtext of that is US American exceptionalism. The idea that this country is uniquely great, and Trump represents a unique perversion of that greatness. that this country was great. Hillary Clinton herself, America is already great. Is it? And let's actually talk about that. Trump says he wants to make America great again. Of course, the question is, when was America great? Professor Horn underscored this perfectly, better than anyone else can, that this is a country, it's a settler colony founded on one of the most massive genocides in human history, then in which hundreds of thousands and millions of people were brought as slaves, and subsequent generations were enslaved and lived under a system of racial apartheid until the 1960s. So when was America great? In the 1970s? Okay, I mean, are we going to turn to the 70s, to the 80s? But that narrative is never challenged, even by ostensibly liberal and progressive media. The notion, again, is that Trump is a unique perversion, even when it comes to the issue, as Paul mentioned earlier, of horrific abuse of immigrants. Well, we frequently never hear, the idea is that Obama was, this great president who, helped immigrants, and he may have had some issues. He may have bailed out the banks and given billions of dollars of taxpayer money to the corporate sector, but he at least, did not incite this hate. That's true. The Obama administration also deported more people than any other administration. The Obama administration was responsible for 2.7 million people being forced out of this country, the vast, vast majority of whom did not have any kind of criminal record. And what's interesting is with this recent story that Paul mentioned of 1,400 migrant children who have been separated from their families and are missing, which is an absolute crime. It should be taken before the International Criminal Court if the US actually recognized it. But what's interesting about this point is that on social media, there was a photo of these young children held in a privatized detention center that looks like a prison. It's effectively a privatized prison. That photo that has been viral was actually a photo taken in 2014. It was a photo from the Obama administration. So we need to understand these systems of oppression that certainly Trump represents an acceleration. And I agree with Professor Horn that we can't downplay the severity that Trump and these far-right forces represent. I mean, they are objectively worse, but fascism does not come out of nowhere. It is a system that is built up, and it's a movement that is built up over many years. And we have to understand how the Obama administration and previous administrations played a key role in fueling that. And that brings me to, I want to discuss quickly foreign policy and the way it's presented by these same resistance media outlets. So it goes without saying as well that the Washington Post is owned by the richest human being on the planet, Jeff Bezos, recently surpassed Bill Gates. It also bears mentioning that Jeff Bezos, as the head of Amazon, has a $600 million contract with $600 billion contract with the CIA and does cloud computing for the CIA. And the degree to which we've seen the two processes simultaneously, these corporate media outlets rebrand themselves as anti-Trump, but at the same time concentrate even further and push out all progressive media. This is an extremely interesting and extremely dangerous phenomenon. So we've seen the complete sidelining of many progressive media outlets that have either folded. Alternet was just bought by the owner of Raw Story. It's effectively just Raw Story now. Alternet basically doesn't even exist anymore. It's now the Independent Media Institute. And we've seen this with other progressive media outlets. And what we see is a centralization on certain talking points. So you can challenge Trump and immigration, but what can never be challenged is, of course, foreign policy. Because when we look, when is Trump portrayed as presidential? Of course, he's presidential when he's bombing foreign countries, when he's bombing Muslims. Of course, the Obama administration, the Nobel Peace Prize winner in his last year, was bombing 7 Muslim-majority countries. He dropped more than 25,000 bombs that year. The Trump administration is continuing that, of course, but Trump is lionized when he's bombing Syria, when he's expanding the war in Afghanistan. So we need to understand that what the resistance really means is only opposition to Trump on particular policies, and particularly policies that are only within US borders. Because again, the idea is that this country is exceptional. What the US says outside of its borders, well, that's up to the military. They can make those decisions. They're responsible. In fact, we're going to hire them. So MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, of course, now you watch it, especially these so-called resistance outlets like MSNBC, they have hired a slew of former CIA, Pentagon, State Department officials who not only are just talking heads that are interviewed, that's common. I mean, you see this in the New York Times. They're paid employees. They appear daily, if not weekly. And that brings me to, I want to talk about a few different things here. So when we look at narratives on these things, Palestine is the most egregious example. We've seen this for a long time. It's gotten a little better, but it's still not great. So here's an example of this. These resistance outlets will humanize, of course, the victims of Trump domestically, but dehumanize those internationally. Just today, a 20-year-old Palestinian medic was murdered in the Gaza Strip. She was moving to treat a protester who was shot by the Israeli military. The IDF, by the way, has boasted, quote, "We know where every bullet landed." They're intentionally targeting civilians. This medic had her hands up, and she was shot and killed. This is the New York Times headline. A woman dedicated to saving lives loses hers in Gaza confrontation. Gaza confrontation? What? She loses hers? What happened? She was shot intentionally by the Israeli military. These are snipers. They know what they're shooting at. But not just that. Greg was talking about AMLO in Mexico. Here's a headline from the Wall Street Journal 2 days ago. Tropical Messiah, a Trump-style politician is Mexican presidential frontrunner. Whoa, a Trump-style politician? I mean, so when it comes, we have to understand that the whole narrative of U.S. exceptionalism has always ended at U.S. borders, and it's always also it ignored oppressed nationalities within the U.S. borders. This is a settler colony, not just to mention slavery and Jim Crow, but also the ongoing genocide of indigenous peoples. There still are indigenous peoples in this country. We see with pipelines, we see with cantonment. I mean, they're still grossly oppressed and colonized by this country. So just finally concluding here, I just think it's important to understand that progressive media outlets have a responsibility to understand that we have to look externally at what the US is doing and not allow what these corporate media outlets present as unique threats to consume with this kind of nationalist narrative any kind of left-wing discourse. There are so many examples of this, but I think one of the most egregious failings we can see is the war in Syria. And I know this is an extremely controversial issue. I'm not going to get into it much, but there's a total editorial uniformity on the war in Syria in virtually every single media outlet, everywhere. This is true for even progressive media outlets, for Democracy Now!, The Intercept, etc. And they still do good work. I'm not in any way, rebuking them, but I'm saying that we have to challenge this uniformity that is bipartisan, and it's also true just for elements of the left. The Real News has fortunately provided a platform for journalists and experts and analysts and people on the ground to challenge this discourse. And frequently when we look at corporate media outlets, the people who are making these discourses, who are fabricating them, are themselves attachés of the state. So we see Washington, D.C. think tanks dominate discourse, especially on issues pertaining to the Middle East. We see people at the Middle East Institute, which is entirely bankrolled by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. We see State Department officials. These are the talking heads that populate media discourse. And this is true also for, say, The Intercept, which frequently quotes Charles Lister, Hassan Hassan. These are the same figures that are quoted in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. We have to, as progressives, as people interested in media work or as activists out here, we have to be able to push back against these narratives that are unchallenged, even by people who say that they want to challenge powerful interests.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. I should just add that before coming to the Real News, and perhaps even now, Ben's been working on the Gray Zone project with Max Blumenthal, and also he was at Alternet and many other publications he was writing at before he joined us. All right, we have to now shift to you. It's your turn. So let's start with some questions, and comments are both welcome. Could I see some hands going up? All right. All right, let's start with you, Leo.
Gar, I wanted you to tell us more about nationalizing the banks, or as I like to put it, taking finance and making it a public utility. here at the Left Forum over the last 10 years, maybe longer, I've organized panels with people from the States and Germany, many of them leading economists. Doug Henwood, not long after his book was published, asking people to talk about how one would go about doing that. And what was striking was how even the best left economists had virtually nothing to say about this. The only contribution that was of any use was the assistant to the shadow finance person in the German parliament for the left party, for Die Linke. And they had actually done a mapping. The Rosa Luxemburg Foundation has since published it, starting from the Sparkassen, which are the local semi-public banks, and building up. But even that model didn't touch Deutsche Bank, which is the largest, most powerful, increasingly worldwide investment bank. So I'd like you to lay out more, because it's so crucial, I think, of what I'm dying to read, that pamphlet you waved, but I think it would be useful for people to hear what you're thinking. I'm talking about at a national level. I'm not talking about North Dakota.
So, thank you for asking about that. It's very interesting because I want to say a word about context and then come to your. Look, we're facing very dire times, and we can stare into the Trump era, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. So I want to underline that none of this talk about an alternative program in the face of the darkness becomes even more important, because what is it that we want has been pasted up as Stalinism. And unless there is a very developed vision of what we want and building blocks that begin to point in a new direction, we don't have a strong answer about where we're going. So you've got to walk on two legs. There's a whole powerful resistance that needs to be developed. I do believe we're going to see worse rather than better in the near term. The Trump administration, I think, is ruthless. That said, Chile went through Pinochet and came out again talking about socialism. So laying down and getting clear about what we mean for a hopeful vision that has concrete tone is a critical element of building the movement. So what this is not a pamphlet, this is a significant study of what, in fact, other countries have done. Nationalization of banks, public banks, are very common around the world. And the argument here is, if you build on different models, in the Swedish case, you could draw on some of the Japanese postal banking system, you can begin to put together the elements of banking that looks like a whole public system. It is not beyond us. I don't have time to go through all the details here. We'll talk a little bit about it tomorrow's panel, and then I'll be happy to get you copies of this. But the argument is that this is no longer beyond us. We have many, many examples of what can be drawn upon and put together as what ought to be done, rather than the big banks running the system and controlling the Fed, which is the way that the operation now runs. So I'm a little bit at a loss for going into a very technical discussion, which I can't do right now, and suggesting that this is not in any way beyond easy possibilities of thinking through the problem. That plus the modern monetary theory, this is another discussion. Folks know what modern monetary theory is. There's a whole development going on the left as well, and progressives, about how to build this, how to actually, the Federal Reserve Board regularly creates money. Now that sounds crazy to most people, but that in fact is what happens. And that creating money is a possible way of beginning to develop a whole part of what we're talking about in a serious progressive strategy. So that's a different part. One is taking over the banking system. The other part is the theory of what you do with the banking system. All I can say, and without going into much detail, is that this is not fancy mathematics. There is a huge store of knowledge about how to do this, and this condenses some of it, drawing on the German system, drawing on the Japanese system, drawing on what the Swedes do regularly. This is not impossible kind of work. It's a political problem, not a technical problem. Is that enough, or maybe you had a more specific question? I would love to go down that track, but then you get pretty detailed. So this will be available on the website of the Democracy Collaborative and it's available free for all of you. It's first a study of how to nationalize the banks.
All right. Just for your information, that question came from Leo Panich with the Socialist Register, York University. And if you don't mind introducing yourself before you.
My name is Maynard Cedar, and I have a question about the poor people. I have a question about the Poor People's Campaign, and it's been 50 years since the death of Martin Luther King and also the demise of the original Poor People's Campaign. And I guess as many people know, there's the beginning of another Poor People's Campaign right now. So my question is, I'm wondering if you've been able to cover it on the Real News Network, and I'm wondering what Professors Alperowitz and Horn think about the possibilities of that campaign. I'm particularly excited about the fact they're bringing in the third part of the triplet, militarism, into the discussion.
All right, let me take that question. From the get-go of the relaunch of the Poor People's Campaign that happened early this year, I think February, in Washington, D.C., which was a gathering of a huge multi-faith community launching the start of it. And we've been on it every single week. Reverend Barber, who is the head of it, as well as the campaign is co-chaired by Reverend Liz Theo Harris. And we have interviewed both of them, as well as we have interviewed many people who are in the leadership of the campaign. And in the last few weeks, where they have launched the Great March to Washington, which will end on June 23rd in Washington, D.C., we have started to follow the campaign. So you will find Eddie Conway and some of our staff at Annapolis, which is our closest venue where the protests are taking place, and we've been there covering it well, but covering it critically as well. One of the gaps we've found is, while there's a lot of wonderful people leading the campaign, poor people are actually missing. And so Eddie's been on the scene asking questions like, where are the people from where Freddie Gray grew up, or where are the people in some of the communities that he works in that should be provided transportation to come to the protests or take the protests to the community, and assist in that process. There's various challenges. Yes, we have been covering it.
I'll echo what I take to be your implicit endorsement of the Poor People's Campaign, and also echo the comments here, and then add that, in a sense, it grows out of what happened in North Carolina, where Reverend Barber's roots are, with the Moral Mondays movement, which is protesting in the state capital of Raleigh for months now about the savage budget cuts. I might also say that, for further background, there's a useful article in the New Yorker by Jelani Cobb that was published a few weeks ago that you may want to look at. And let me broaden the discussion, since we are here in New York, and ask if anyone has anything to say about the Working Families Party, which, at least as I read the story, has been pushing Governor Cuomo to the left on a number of different issues, and of course has incurred a certain amount of criticism as a result. And likewise, with regard to these primaries that are going to take place in California in a few days. As you know, California has moved to the jungle primary. The top two primary winners then square off against each other in November. And so one of the questions for the governor's race to succeed Jerry Brown is whether or not the Republicans will be shut out altogether, because Villaraigosa, the former mayor of Los Angeles, and Gavin Newsom, the present lieutenant governor, will emerge as the top two candidates. Gavin Newsom, of course, is leading in the polls, but I guess the larger question about the top two primaries that I think it would be of interest to an audience such as this is that, in some ways, it led to a withering on the vine of third-party alternatives, because it really weakened the third-party movement in the state of California. And also, it's complicated the effort to take back the House, because there are a number of Republicans in the California congressional delegation that may survive precisely because of the top two primary system. In other words, there are so many Democrats who are clamoring to take their place that they may split that vote and then allow a Republican to emerge at least, or perhaps even two Republicans in some districts to emerge. And so, if anybody is familiar with California, we may want to talk about trying to revise that system, which of course many of us opposed in the first place, because we did foresee accurately that it would lead to a withering of third-party alternatives to the Democrats.
Anyone else want to respond to that question? All right, I think the gentleman in the orange shirt, if you could introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, my name is Joe Marcinkowski, Houston Peace and Justice Center. I wanted to talk about Greg Wilperds, who was my hero. He taught me more about Venezuela than I needed to know at that point and got involved. But his statements even today, and our media is horrible with Central and South America. When Mr. Mate was speaking, he was speaking about Russiagate. And he's really good at calling bullshit when people come out there and start talking about Russiagate. And we should be doing the same thing with South America and Central America. Like Lula there is no evidence Lula did anything wrong. He's in jail. And Delma was thrown out without any evidence. And you got the creepiest crook in the world in there right now with Terma. And what happened in Ecuador? We lost a left president there. Where was the outrage in the United States about losing him and getting in a right-wing guy that's going to put Assange in jail? And in Bolivia, he's the last holdout that we have over there. And Argentina, damn, the mobs are out in the street in Argentina. We don't hear anything about that here. These things are, when Dr. Horn was talking about this liberal elite, the liberal elite is shutting this down. There's no way we're going to get any help out of the liberal elite. We got to do it ourselves.
All right. Do we have any other questions? We have a few brief minutes.
Sorry.
Oh, that gentleman there does have a question, Gerald.
Sure. So thank you all for your work and your comments. Dr. Horn, you said something along the lines of, if we're going to develop a new strategy, we may need a new conception of how we arrived at this moment. And somewhat going to the last comment and other comments, I think some of our challenges just relates to numbers. They have more people spitting out the lies and the misinformation and historical inaccuracies than we do. They have institutions that allow to scale. And obviously, as a media and news organization, many of you are familiar with those challenges. But if you could just touch on how we can scale the work that you're doing, increase the amount of messengers who could communicate a more accurate depiction of how we've arrived at this moment, because our opponents are very good at doing that, and obviously having resources aids in that ability. But if you can just touch on that so that as a matter of strategy, we can move forward.
Well, just briefly, I think if you look at the history of slavery and Jim Crow, and I hope this doesn't sound too discouraging, but I think if we had just relied upon the forces within the four corners of the United States, a person like myself would still be sold on the open market. The fact is that we lengthened the battlefield. That is to say, we relied heavily on international forces, global forces, and I think Mr. Trump is setting that up for us by alienating Germany, alienating France, alienating Japan, alienating Canada, Mexico, et cetera. It's opening the possibility for more global alliances against these forces here in the United States. And I don't disparage any kind of domestic struggle. That's why I was making reference to William Barber's movement and the Working Families Party, the top two primaries, et cetera. But I think we would be making a grave blunder if we did not take advantage of this new international situation that's slowly coming into view as a result of the ham-fisted foreign policies, to use your term, of the 45th President of the United States of America. And that means, of course, with regard to the Real News, continuing what it has been doing in terms of its outstanding global coverage. It might also mean having more packages from friends. I know, Paul comes out of the CBC, for example. More packages from Italy, which is going through a major crisis right now. So I think that we're really, in the final analysis, really going to have to try to lengthen the battlefield, because if you look historically in terms of profound transformations of the socioeconomic system, that's really how it came about. Of course, we can delude ourselves otherwise if we so choose.
We can't scale it right now. We don't have the resources. We are actively searching to identify some heirs and heiresses, to be honest with you, because there are some people around that happen to have money who also have a fairly progressive view of the world. But at the moment, scaling it isn't our biggest problem. Our biggest problem is we have to do much better at talking to ordinary working people. We're good at talking to policy wonks, and I think we're the best policy wonk place you can find to talk about issues. And I'm using that term, but it's not really, I don't want to demean the importance of that, because you can't talk to ordinary working people if you don't really have a deep understanding of the situation. So, but the next phase of the Real News, and the reason we came to Baltimore, is why are we doing the Real News? Because we want change. So we went to the place where there's people that need and want change the most. And we also think that's where change is actually going to come from. I'm all for people influencing the elites, and if they can get something out of them, great. But it's not our job. If they watch our policy stuff, I'm happy. But I don't think that's where change is coming from. Change is coming from when the economy, next time, it's in deep shit, and we all know that periodically happens, and every so often it's deeper than other times. Will there be pockets of people ready to take advantage of that moment? And take advantage of that moment means, we have a slogan we used in the Real News. Our board thought it didn't sound journalistic, so we don't say it very often. But it's, don't roll over, take over. So we want to help facilitate ordinary people to take over. So what does that mean? So it means we're in Baltimore, we're going hyper local, down to a few neighborhoods. We think we can actually beat corporate news media in a city like Baltimore because it's surrounded by a wealthy white county, and advertising-driven model means they don't care much about the city. So we think if we learn how to tell the stories about the urgency of the situation, what effective solutions look like to the day-to-day problems facing people, any schools, policing, unemployment, and talk to people about the urgency of the big picture in terms of climate and most importantly. If we can learn how to talk to an ordinary audience and break through to a mass audience, that we can scale. And we're also, Dr. Horn talked about, people having this idea that the Trump voter can be won over and such. I think he's right in a sense, but you have to segment that Trump voter. There's a section, we interviewed a guy in Dundalk, and he says, Dundalk is a Rust Belt kind of place outside of Baltimore. It used to be Bethlehem Steel, and now is classic Rust Belt, high unemployment, white working class that used to vote Democratic Party, 80% voted Trump. And the guy in a diner that Trump campaigned in, he says, we know Trump's a liar. We know he's a clown. We know he's corrupt, and we vote him for him anyway. What does that tell you about what we think of everybody else? So we are going to do another hyper-local experiment, if you will. We're going to Lancaster County, which is a very interesting district in this next election, which is Lancaster City is fairly progressive, surrounded by a county that's voting Trump. And we're going to go into Trump country. And we're going to do the same thing in Baltimore and in this area of Lancaster County. We're going to create what we're calling community editorial committees. And we're going to ask people, what are you concerned about? What are the questions do you have? And we're going to go do investigative stories to try to answer their questions and then bring it back to them and let them respond. And that's going to be a show itself. So we're going to, by going hyper local and not going, for example, to Trump voters as representatives of corporate Dems, because the only time the people in these areas ever hear anything outside of a Fox News kind of messaging, it's coming from a corporate Democrat who they have zero faith in, and for good reason. So we think through this kind of hyper-local process, we need to do way better. But if we learn how to talk to people in these different populations, then we start to scale. And I also think people will be far more interested in giving us the resources to scale it. So that's our strategy.
All right, last word to you, Gar, and then we have to wrap it up. People are gathering for the next session.
It's, no, I want to underline something that's come out of what Paul was saying. And I think the left has abandoned the working class in general, black, brown, and white. And indeed, I worked with the Youngstown steelworkers in Youngstown when the big crash went down, and some of you know about the 70s. We have stopped talking. I'm from Wisconsin, but the exploitation of the white and black divisions, there's nobody working on the white working class as well as a Hispanic. So we must divide. This country's got 3 divisions, and unless we have begin dealing across the board, we're, I think, lost. So I want to underline what Paul's saying, and I think that is a real failure of the left to address the 3 major groups directly. So just to underline it.
All right, thank you all for joining us.